Well, hi everyone who's watching on the live stream. I'm Lily Ferrand, your moderator for this evening, and I'm here with Abby Phillip. And for those of you who don't know, she's an anchor and senior political correspondent for CNN. She's currently the host of Inside Politics with Abby Phillip. Has previously worked for the Washington Post, ABC, as a moderator for a presidential debate, among many other roles. And the New York Times called her the next generation of CNN. One could argue she is just the next generation of journalism, period. So thank you so much for being here today with me, Abby. And thank you to all of you who submitted questions. Just before we start, I want to give a huge shout out to USG's Student Development Committee and Student Development Advocacy Director Neha Sistu for all of their work on this initiative. So now, Abby, to start, thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, Lily. It's so great to be here with you guys too. I'm really excited for tonight and the questions that I know have already been submitted, so I'm ready. We'll do it.
So to start, I'd like to know kind of what this is a question that I think a student submitted in. What was it like to cover the Trump administration as a woman of color?
Well, I think the best way to describe it is surreal in a lot of ways. I mean, not even just as a woman of color, but just as a journalist in general. For so many of us, I think it felt like every day just got more crazy than the one that came before it. And interestingly, as a reporter, that was our experience covering the Trump administration, but that was also the experience of my sources. I would People I would be talking to who worked for Trump would always be like, "This is crazy." I think they were surprised even by the chaos and the craziness of the first couple of years of Trump. But I think the other thing, just as a woman of color, as a person of color, this was a real moment where, as my colleague Maggie Haberman says, the quiet part was said out loud about a lot of things when it came to using the bully pulpit of the presidency for really expanding our racial divides in this country, revealing them in a lot of ways, in ways that were way more unvarnished than they had been revealed in a long time. And that was really extraordinary to cover. I think it was also an important moment for a lot of journalists of color to really step up and be kind of the voice of clarity in our newsrooms to say, let's not beat around the bush about what this is. Let's call it like it is. Let's bring to bear our understanding of American history, of recent history, and, decades long history to really understand what's going on here. And so it was a challenging time, but it was a really important time for journalists of color like myself to say to our bosses and our colleagues, like, look, let's just say what this, let's Charlottesville is a great example. I mean, the racism on display in that day and the way in which it was coddled from the White House, I think was a moment for a lot of other reporters, but for reporters of color, we had to say, let's not pretend that what this was not a real sort of almost like a reenactment of kind of Jim Crow era racial terrorism. And I think that there were so many moments like that for all of us.
Kind of what is the biggest lesson you take from the Trump era, being a journalist covering that moment in time?
It's about being clear and honest with our audience. I think that a lot of journalists are worried about being accused of bias if they just speak the truth. And the lesson for me and for many of my colleagues of the Trump era is that the truth is the truth and we should just speak it. And there's no need to create false equivalency on issues where there is no equivalency, right? Just because we want to be perceived as being even-handed, as giving one side the same footing as the other side. You can't do that when there are clear answers. There's a clear right and wrong. This thing happened and that thing didn't. The very first time that I think many reporters had to deal with this was literally the very first press briefing in which the White House press secretary Sean Spicer tried to tell the entire world that there were massive crowds where there were not massive crowds. There were many times where we saw and experienced things with our own eyes. We saw them, the world saw it, and officials were trying to tell us otherwise. And journalism is not about giving oxygen to lies that are easily disproven by facts, by things that you can see and you can hear with your own eyes. And that's the lesson in a lot of ways of the Trump era. One of the Trump quotes I will never forget is at a rally, early in his presidency, he literally told his supporters, "Don't believe what you see and hear, believe what I tell you." And that was very prescient because we've been confronted with that reality a lot. And it's just a reminder that that is what people in power might want to do. They will tell people, forget what your lying eyes just showed you. Just listen to what's coming out of my mouth. And as journalists, we are supposed to call that out.
Yeah, I mean, a huge part of Trump's legacy is this rhetoric of like fake news, don't trust CNN, don't trust these liberal media outlets. And, as you know, press freedom is critical for the survival of democracy. So how has that legacy, that rhetoric, kind of shaped the state of journalism and press freedom in 2022? It's a very similar question, but
Yeah, well, one of the things that we learned in the Trump era is that this rhetoric about fake news was exported globally to authoritarian countries, from the Philippines to Russia to China to where have you. It was exported. Um, Authoritarians around the world looked to how Trump dealt with the press here in the United States and emulated him. His language in official press releases, in statements that they made, and so there's that. There's also the fact that, fake news ceased to have any meaning. I mean, fake news would literally be used to describe things that he just didn't like. And that kind of there is there is a real thing where in which disinformation is a real problem in our country and around the world, where people are literally being fed fake information, false information that's designed to mislead them. That's a real thing. But the rhetoric of fake news really diminished people's understanding of what real fake news is. And so that's an unfortunate side effect of this all. I think we have a real problem in this country with people not being able to differentiate the truth from the falsehoods. We have a problem of our voting populace being vulnerable to attacks by foreign governments who simply have to just dupe you on the internet in order to affect how you think about issues and change the politics of our country. And until we start to deal with that, we're never going to really get past it. And I think this rhetoric of fake news really set us back a lot in dealing with that core fundamental problem that continues to undermine our democracy.
would you say that kind of undoing that now is the biggest battle that journalists are facing, or kind of what are you guys up
It's
against?
it's certainly one of the biggest battles that we are facing as a country. Disinformation, misinformation is everywhere. There is an entire look, I mean, not that everything revolves around Trump, really, it doesn't. But I do think we have to be honest that, you know, um, the former president is the leader of a major political party in this country. And at the moment, he is leading them on the basis of lie, a massive lie that he won the last election, which he did not, that there was massive fraud in the last election, which there was not, that there was a conspiracy in the last election to cause him to lose, which there absolutely was not. And all of these lies are being peddled through, just tons and tons of misinformation and disinformation online. And so we really have to deal with that as a country because that is really at the core of who we are as a democracy. If we don't have free and fair elections in this country, if we don't have trust in our elections in this country, we don't have a democracy anymore. And so that's, you know, to your question, it is, yeah, it is perhaps the biggest challenge that we have, not just for that reason, but because you know, an informed electorate, an informed electorate is what makes the United States able to persist as a democracy. And if our electorate is progressively becoming less informed, we've got a real problem on our hands. We are vulnerable to threats, domestic and foreign. And as journalists, it's not our responsibility to resolve all of that. There are a lot of other players in this, politicians and community leaders and everybody, radio shock jocks, whatever. But we do play a role in it, and we're affected by it as a, as an entity. We can't do our jobs when people can't agree on basic facts.
So then, what kind of is the role of journalists? If we're fake news isn't everything, and it doesn't really necessarily mean what Trump is saying it does. But in a lot of ways, as a country, we're not just arguing about politics; we're arguing about facts. And so, you know, part of the reason we're polarized is because we're stuck in these, political news silos. How do we stop this train? Uh,
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's such a good framing. The news silos that people are in is a huge part of the problem. W- There are a couple ways. I mean, first of all, I think we need to teach people how to consume information in ways that make them smarter in a lot of ways. People don't understand how to differentiate what's true from what's false when they read it, when they hear it from their friends, when they get it in a text message or in an email. This is not just about Facebook and Twitter and whatever. It's not just about the social media entities, although that's one vehicle for disinformation. We just don't have we have not equipped people with the instinct to, before you reshare or pass something on, to ask themselves, how do I know this to be true? What's the evidence that has been presented to me that this thing that I've just been told is true? It's a really simple question. How do I know that this is true? And if more people just asked that question, we would automatically be in a better place. There's that. But I also think, to your point about news silos, helping people understand where to get news from reliable sources. Not to say you should only read the New York Times or only watch CNN or whatever, but to give them more options that are reliable, that are not conspiratorial or deceptive in nature. And if we can do that as an industry, as a society, I think we would also be better off. But unfortunately, what's happening is that people are gaining new sources of information, but they're not news. They have no standards. They are no better than propaganda outlets, and they are presenting themselves as news, and they are being allowed to present themselves as news when they're not. And that's confusing people. So it's not just the existence of many options, it's also people understanding what is high quality and what's low quality. And it doesn't steer anybody into any sort of ideological place, but just to say, you know, this news organization has a reputation for being correct, for having standards, for, you know, the things that as a journalist I grew up learning about the basics of the ethics of what we do. And there's no longer a sense of journalistic ethics in a lot of places. And I think that that is really, really hurting our ability to just move forward in this information internet age in which everything is available to people at their fingertips.
Yeah, and that's it kind of makes me think of the whole like Joe Rogan situation that's going on now. I don't want to bring up a what's clearly like kind of controversial topic, but the lines between entertainment and news have gotten so
Yeah.
blurred, and people really love this like subversive voice that is Joe Rogan, and it's hard to kind of convey to people that it's actually like really dangerous without them thinking that First Amendment rights are being infringed upon. So I don't know what your kind of take is
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that line between what is entertainment and what is news is 100% being blurred. Okay. You know, it's not just Joe Rogan, it's a lot of other networks that I won't name that are purport to be mainstream news outlets that have 3 hours of entertainment in the morning and 3 hours of entertainment at night. And they're not honest with their audience about that. And but Rogan is, he is an entertainer, but now you're not getting the news. Your people who are consuming him are not consuming him through, you know, CNN or NBC or whatever. They're consuming him through Spotify. And what is Spotify's responsibility to its audience? I think that's a real open question. What responsibility do these entities have to their audience to give them transparency about what they're consuming? I think that these are some of the big questions that we have to answer. We have to answer it for Spotify. We have to answer it for Facebook, which is a major distributor of news now. It's people would argue it is a publisher of news now. We have to answer it about Google. We have to answer it about Twitter, so on and so forth. And that's where I think the questions get really tough. And I don't have any, profound answers about it because I think it's hard. It's really hard to balance people's free speech and balance, before Joe Rogan, there was, whether it's Rush Limbaugh or Alex Jones. I mean, there are people like him who have been out there forever. It's not a new format. It's just that we're having this debate again with a different person.
That's it's very true. And just thinking about, again, entertainment and news and the responsibility of these news networks. I thinking of this Chris Hayes quote from Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized book, where he basically is saying that on some level, journalists are like wedding DJs, and the wedding DJ's job is, he says, is to get you on the floor. And I want to ask, what's your advice to aspiring journalists on how to find the balance between being that wedding DJ, so like satisfying and growing your audience, and also being as straightforward and unbiased as possible?
uh, well, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I mean, my feeling is that people want honesty and authenticity, actually. I mean, that at the end of the day, that's what people want. And they gravitate toward people, journalists who they believe are informing them, especially, and if you're in the world that I'm in television journalism, who they can identify with, not just in terms of who you are, who I am, but because of how you communicate to them. And so, um, being truthful and straightforward and honest, I think, is the best pathway to getting as many people on the floor as possible, right? And you can also get a lot of people on the floor by lying and being deceptive and, you know, I don't know, demonizing other people, creating outrage and creating anger and riling people up. You can get people on the floor that way too, right? But I also think that you can create an audience, you can grow your audience, you can draw people in. I think people want to trust you, and you can develop trust by being honest with them and by admitting to them. One of the things that try to say all the time, whenever it's possible, whenever it's true, is we don't know sometimes what's going to happen. Sometimes we don't know how this is going to play politically. And we shouldn't pretend like we do know when we don't. We don't know what the audience, what the outcome is going to be of a political investigation. We should just be upfront with people about that. And I think that people respond to that honesty, and in some ways, I guess, vulnerability, you could call it. But I think that that is, at least for me, the strategy that I'm going to take. So
Yeah, thank you. That very similar question, kind of to that. What are you thinking about when you are talking to people on your show and presenting the news? What is kind of your mantra?
I always try to think about how would I actually communicate this to a person that I actually know? You and I were joking right before we got on about our moms watching us. My mom watches me all the time on CNN. I used to tell her not to because it would make me really nervous. But I do think about it. Like, how would I explain this to my mom? How would I explain this to my sister or my best friend? If I were going out to dinner with someone and they asked me, "What do you think about this thing?" What's the answer I would give to them at dinner? And I try to get as close to that as possible on television because there are a lot of ways that you can do television news and journalism. And some people will totally disagree with me on this. Some people think that news reporters should just be like straight faced, you know, I don't want to say robotic, but just sort of like you're so kind of like it's like professional, the news anchor voice, right? Everybody knows the news anchor voice from your local TV station or whatever. Nothing wrong with that. But I do think that how I approach it is different from that intentionally because I don't like to be talked to like that personally. I think it's weird and I think that people want to feel like they're not being talked down to or they're not being read to. And so the more that we can get to a place where we're telling people in an unvarnished way as possible what is really happening, talking to them conversationally, really getting to the bottom of the things that sometimes go unsaid especially in political journalism. There's a lot of political journalism that is about um, kind of the old boys club or like the secret things that nobody really talks about. And taking the cover off of some of that stuff and really revealing to people what's really going on, that's to me how I would prefer to approach things. And I think that your generation, for example, also prefers that. You guys are growing up in an era in which people are just literally whipping out their phones and broadcasting from their phones. So I don't know, why would we communicate to each other in ways that no human being communicates with another human being in real life? So, I mean, that is about the delivery of it, but it's also about the substance of it too. It's also to say, I'm going to actually talk to you about this like you're my friend and not like you're somebody I need to like teach, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. Do you think commentators, journalists today are doing a good job of talking directly to people? Is that from your peers a similar style that you see them kind of have?
I think a lot of them, not everyone. I mean, everybody has their own personal style, but I think a lot of them do that instinctively because that is what the essence of authenticity is. And and it's not necessarily a generational thing. I mean, maybe some younger people do it, maybe they don't. Maybe some older people do it, maybe they don't. But when I think about my colleagues who I think are the most effective at communicating, like for example, Anderson Cooper is an extraordinary interviewer, and he is because he talks to people like they're real people. And I think that and he relates to people on a real level. And that works whether you're talking to them about a horrible tragedy that occurred to them, or whether you're talking to them about an obscure Senate procedure that maybe they've never heard of, but you need to break it down to them and explain to them what this is really all about and what really matters about this conversation that we're having about politics. So I think more and more people are doing it because they realize that um, the old kind of broadcast, like, again, the legends of the old world of journalism brought us to this point. It's not to say anything negative about that, but I think that there has been a shift away from that toward more conversational journalism that makes people feel like they are a part of the conversation, not like they are being talked at.
No, I that's really interesting because I always think of it like, there's the camp that's like, gone are the days of Walter Cronkite, and then on the other side, it's and then those people are also saying like, modern, news is super biased and all this stuff, and then everyone else who's kind of all for this like super casual journalism. I guess basically what I'm saying is that I hadn't heard of that kind of take on it. The idea it's not just bias and it's not this old broadcast journalism. It's like just talking to a
Yeah.
real person. I'm not sure how to articulate that, but that's just an interesting kind of
Yeah.
view on it. I hadn't heard.
And I you brought up the word bias, which I think is a really important part of this conversation, that a lot of people when they talk about how things have shifted, they lament this feeling that, oh, Walter Cronkite was unbiased, you know, Edward R. Murrow unbiased. Were they unbiased? Or did we just not talk about their biases? I think that we should just be honest that we all come to the table with something, right? We all come from somewhere. We all learn things somewhere. We all, have a background. We bring something to this job. And we should just be honest with people about that. And don't act like it doesn't exist because you can't, as much as you might try, you can't bury all of that under the sand and pretend like it doesn't exist. The anchors of old didn't do that. They came to the news with their biases. We just thought that their biases were okay. And so the fact that people are being more honest about it is good and it's important. It doesn't mean that suddenly all of a sudden people have biases and they didn't before. That's not what that means.
That's also a great point, a great way of looking at it. Because you're right, Walter Cronkite did have probably a ton of biases, and no one ever, thinks
We
of
just
it.
we just take for granted sometimes that maybe some of the people that we got our news from, they all came from the same cities and went to the same five schools, and maybe they all grew up upper middle class, and not one of them had ever, spent a lot of time with all the different communities that exist in this country, in this nation. And that's who they were, but that doesn't mean that that is the default, that that's okay just because it's what we're used to. It's just that those are their biases. We know what they are, and we should factor that in when we take in information from them, just like we do today.
And then this is another question that kind of was, I think, belief maybe came from the committee. Um, that there's a lot of talk about right wing news bias, but one question that was submitted asked how can left leaning sources avoid falling into that same trap, such as our campus newspaper, the Daily Campus, is
Mhm.
predominantly left leaning.
Hmm. That's interesting. So yeah, it's a great question. I mean, um, there's a difference between being ideological and being a source of misinformation or disinformation, right? So if you're going to be a left-leaning or a right-leaning outlet, it's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with that. I read right-leaning outlets all the time, regularly, in fact, to understand that perspective in the political spectrum, and and left-leaning outlets as well. But it's about, are you telling the truth or are you not? Like, there are some people out there who are not telling the truth. And so the first pitfall is don't lie to people. That is the first pitfall. And I think, secondly, you lose credibility even with adherence to your own ideology. So, like if you are left leaning, but you lose credibility when you fail to call out things in your camp that are wrong or need to be called out. And I do think that that is the trap that a lot of ideological outlets fall into. They lose credibility with all kinds of audiences when they don't gut check themselves about things that are plainly, maybe wrong or not right, or they fall for lies and misinformation, or they take things out of context. So, I mean, I'm not sure I'm fully answering the question, but I just want to preface this by saying I really don't think that there's anything wrong with ideological news. I think if you are right leaning and you read, let's say, the National Review, that's fine. That's okay. If you read The Nation and you're left leaning, that is also fine. But when those outlets start being like, I'm actually forgetting what they are now. But some of these, especially right-wing outlets that literally fabricate things, take people grossly out of context. They are used as a propaganda arm for politicians. Those are the pitfalls, right? And I've seen sometimes left-leaning individuals, journalists, um, they fall into traps. They want to believe so badly a negative thing about the other side that they will take something where there's no context about it and run with it, and it turns out it's false. And so those are the pitfalls for sure. But if you're going to be ideological, just be upfront about it. Don't pretend like that's not what you're doing. And if you're upfront about it, people can take you at face value and they can properly contextualize what you're telling them.
Do you think sometimes then that ideological journalism can cross over into kind of demonizing the other side, perhaps unnecessarily?
Sure. I mean, in general, politics and political ideology will do that, right? People want to root for their own team. And sometimes that's easier when you demonize the other side. It's just the nature of it. And and I think that that's frankly, I mean, that's going to happen in ideological journalism on both sides. That is going to happen. uh, Sometimes people are as bad as they are made out to be by their political enemies, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes people are multidimensional and they're doing things for a lot of different reasons. But if you're in the ideological space, there's not very much room for you to acknowledge that. And that's why I think things get really personal and vitriolic sometimes in those spaces. And, if you choose to go down that road, which many people who want to pursue journalism, they will pursue journalism in that vein. You just have to know that that is one of the side effects of going down that road.
Makes that makes sense. Kind of segueing to a different conversation. How has social media changed politics and political journalism these last, 5 or so years?
A lot. I mean, so much. I mean, when I first became a journalist, over 10 years ago, Twitter had just kind of started. And so it was a relatively new thing. It was used mostly for me in like a professional way. And actually, I mean, I don't know, do you use Twitter, Lily? Like, do you and your peers use Twitter?
Don't think it's like the most popular social media
Or-
form. Like I have it, but it's not really something we use to
Yeah.
like interact at all.
I always found it really interesting that people who were just a few years younger than me, like when Twitter had been a little bit more developed, they used Twitter as a real social tool to actually communicate with their real life friends. Whereas when I got on Twitter, which was pretty early on, it was really just a tool to disseminate like journalism, you know? And so it served a very different purpose. And now it's some combination of the two. And honestly, that's like not good. I mean, my personal feeling is that it's not good. The kind of discourse that I see on a lot of social media platforms, but increasingly on Twitter to the point where I find it very much not useful. It's um it's incredibly siloed, it's vitriolic, it's false. There's most of the stuff on these social media platforms are not true, and it makes it so easy for lies to spread like wildfire. It is absolutely poisoning our politics, making journalism more difficult. And then on top of that, you have politicians who literally spend all of their time thinking about what they can tweet that will go viral in their conservative or liberal silos. I mean, it's wild. Politicians are elected to actually do things, to serve, to pass laws, to deliberate. And many of them today are spending a lot of time, their staff is spending a lot of time sitting around thinking, what can I tweet that will get me to go viral among conservatives, among liberals? There's no way in the world that that is a positive thing for our democracy. And it really creates a distorted incentive structure for people to move to the extremes on either side. That for in order to get validation or out of fear of being condemned, people say certain things or take certain positions literally because of what people will say about them on the internet. I mean, I don't, there's no solution to that. Social media is not going away, but I find it to be increasingly, I used to think it was very useful. It was an important reporting tool. And now I think in a lot of ways, those, the usefulness is not being outweighed by the damage that it's done. Do I think that like, it should be done away with? I don't really care, frankly, whether it's done away with or not. I just think when you as an individual make a decision about what social media platforms you use, I personally, if I didn't have to necessarily like use some of these platforms for professional reasons, I'm not sure that I would do it.
Yeah. No, Twitter is kind of a hellhole, I'd say. But so does it feel then like politicians have almost on Twitter kind of taken over the role of journalists in some way?
Mhm.
Um, on kind of reporting news, are people turning to, Senator so and so instead of other credible news sources for information, or is that not what you're seeing?
They might very well be. I mean, I actually find that members of Congress can be some of the worst purveyors of false information. They tend to amplify things that are just flatly false without caring about whether it's false or not. And that is part of the problem. And because they are members of Congress or whatever, senators, rep Congress people, they are viewed as validated sources, even when they are, you know, spreading false information. For example, I am on the board of an organization called the News Literacy Project, and one of the things that we do is we try to um, kind of highlight some of how this operates on the internet, how things that are false get spread around, and how you can determine what's true from what's false. And the one that we did this past week was a congressman retweeting a quote that claimed to be from the French philosopher Voltaire, but that was actually from a neo-Nazi. And I mean, it's mind-boggling, but that really happened. And because it's a congressperson, it gets spread around and people think it's true, even though that person didn't do any due diligence whatsoever. And so, yeah, I mean, um, I don't think that they are replacing journalists, but I do think that because of how information spreads on social media, they are important validators for information that is true and information that's false. And when they spread falsehoods, it really does exponential damage compared to what happens if just a random person on the street were to tweet or retweet something.
And another social media question, thinking back to summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, what do you see as the role of like smartphone and civilian reporting in the pursuit of justice?
Yeah, I mean it's huge. Civilian documentation of things in real time is, I think, one of the most important forces in journalism in the last, let's say 15 years. And whether it's Michael Brown and Ferguson, or George Floyd, or um, I remember Philando Castile, who was shot in his vehicle. I remember that his girlfriend, who was in the car at the time, she recorded it. I mean, it, I remember watching that and thinking, if if she hadn't done that, we would never have seen the chaos and the just the truly horrible nature of that incident. There was a baby in the back seat. There's so many things like that, where really ordinary people, in an attempt to create transparency and to protect themselves, are recording things and creating that first draft of history that we as journalists have always been taught we would be doing. We're now like really kind of like the second draft now, because the first draft is really when people themselves are recording things that happen to them, either on video or through tweets or through live broadcasts. And so we get to actually have a second crack at it, taking in all of that information and trying to help people process it. So I think it's probably one of the most important features of modern journalism, and it's changed the course of this country. There's no question about it. You could argue whether it's been for the better or for the worse, but there's no question about it that it's really illuminated for a lot of people in the country the reality of the experiences. Particularly, you talked about justice, the reality of the experiences for Black and Brown people in this country. It so often, a lot of Americans don't understand it because they don't have any way to understand it. It's not their experience. But one of the things that videos do is that they bring you into that moment. And it's inescapable what happens to someone when you're watching it. And I think it really it has an opportunity to expand our ability for empathy. But as we all know, I mean, it's not everything. I mean, since George Floyd, a lot of things have happened and a lot of things have not happened. I don't know that we've had like a real, you know, sea change in the real practical way in which we talk and deal with policing and communities of color in this country since then. I think people hope that we would, but I don't think that that has happened.
And it's a really interesting line about being the second draft of history in the social media age. And in that vein, what does the future of journalism, and then more specifically, what does the future of CNN look like?
Yeah. Um, it's actually for that reason. My belief that because of all of this, social media and whatnot, we are now, okay, the second draft of history. It means that we have a greater responsibility to put things in its appropriate context. It's no longer okay just to regurgitate because we're just putting out the information into the world for the first time. More than likely, when we as journalists are conveying information to an audience, it's not the first time that information has been put out into the world. And so it's our responsibility to properly contextualize it for our audience, to get to the bottom of what's true and what's false in what we see has happened. And as it relates to the future of journalism, or CNN specifically, I mean, there's a need now for n- news organizations to develop a different kind of relationship with our audience, one that is still based on trust, but one where our audience understands what we do, and they and we explain to them with transparency what we do, why we do it. And I think that's going to be a real challenge because there's a lot of distrust out there. And I don't really think that the distrust honestly is that unwarranted. I think people rightfully feel like they don't know who to trust. Our task is to convince them that it's okay and important and good to trust us. And we have to earn that. And we have to earn it by telling them the truth, by not sugarcoating things when we know that we need to be, unvarnished about things that are happening. We need to earn it by being transparent about our shortcomings, about when we don't get things right or when we don't have enough information to make it under, to understand what has happened. That's one of the big lessons that we learned, during election week in 2020 was just, it was like 4 days of just telling people, look, stick with us. We know that it's unsatisfying to not know right now, but we are taking our time with this process because it's important to get it right. And I do think that by conveying that to our audience incredibly transparently in that period of time, it really helped. I think people did trust us. They were with us. And when we were the first to call the race, they were with us. They believed us. And so there's proof that that transparency works, and figuring out how um, to really apply that in a lot of different situations as we go forward, and as more and more people are confronted with more and more information. That's our big challenge. It's going to be difficult, but that's what we've got to do.
And very similarly, what advice do you have for future journalists on taking on those that task ahead of earning the public's trust?
Yeah. You got to do a gut check, right? Um, when you are writing or saying something, whether you're a television journalist, radio, print, blog, Substack, whatever it is, always do a gut check about, is what I'm saying really the most accurate, honest version of what is going on? I know that sounds obvious, but it's not that obvious, right? I think sometimes we get caught in cliches, we get caught in conventional wisdom, and we rely on conventional wisdom as opposed to um, really like honest reporting and analysis of what's going on. And so there's that. I also think that journalists today, because our responsibility now is that second draft, you really do need to be you need to be a student of history, a student of modern history, a student of not so modern history. You need to understand the context in which this country exists and the world that we are operating in. And it means that you have to constantly be learning and not taking for granted that there's nothing new under the sun, really, in American politics, that there's an antecedent to everything. And if you're going to be an effective journalist, you need to be aware of that. I'm not saying you need to have an encyclopedic knowledge of everything in the past, but you need to be aware of that, that in order to best do your job understanding today, you have to know that there's a past to today's event. There's a history to it. And getting to that history will help you become a better journalist. It will help you give your viewers and your readers better context. It will help you be less naive and not fooled when people try to tell you things that are not true. Because that happens too. I mean, I in the Trump era, there were a lot of people who were new to the beat, to like, for example, being a White House reporter. And it was very easy for them to get misled by White House officials who themselves didn't know much about like the history of how the place worked. And and that's why being a veteran at things actually does matter. There are a lot of people who've been covering the White House for decades, and their experience does matter because they don't get bamboozled when somebody tells them, "Oh no, this is how it's always worked." They know that's not how it's always worked, and they can refer back to that knowledge. And so having that context and that background in your pocket is invaluable. And being a journalist is a learning job. It's not a static thing. You are always learning. That's what makes it such a great career, but it's challenging because you can't, rely on you can't like rest on your laurels as a journalist, nor should you.
And then, what advice do you have for women of color looking to get into a career in journalism?
I, I always give the same advice, and it's honestly, it's stick with it. that it can be very tempting when you encounter resistance to you, when you feel isolated, when you feel alone in this career, to say, this isn't for me. I've got to get out of here. I've got to go do something else. My advice is always stick with it, because perseverance is in and of itself a victory. And the more you persevere through, you know, outright discrimination, quiet discrimination, loneliness, isolation, feeling like you stand out, like nobody sees things the way that you do, the more you persevere through those things, which you will experience if you are a person of color, a black woman, a brown woman, whatever, um, the more you persevere through those things, you're going to end up at the end of the day, you're going to end up somewhere where those differences and those experiences are going to come to bear and are going to differentiate you from all the other people around you. And I also think, because I experienced this myself, that I realized pretty early on in my career that so many people who looked like me had actually gotten out of the business. And because they were no longer around, I always felt alone, because there weren't as many people to look up to as I wanted there to be. And so, in order to prevent that from happening for the person who's coming up behind you, you have to be there. And when you stay there, more people are going to come up behind you, and then there will be strength in numbers, and it will get easier to navigate these situations. You'll find mentors and you'll find friends, and you'll find allies who may not look anything like you. Your allies in your news organization might be the opposite of you, and that's okay too. So, you just stick with it and persevere through it. And at the end of the day, I am confident. I'm confident it will pay off.
Uh, this might be a kind of a ridiculous question, but how do you like being a journalist? Like, what do you what do you like about your job? Are you most excited about every day going to work?
I I mean, I love being a journalist. I think it's the most interesting job in the world. You will always be the toast of the cocktail party as a journalist, because your life is probably inherently more interesting than most of your peers. That's just the truth, is that you're usually doing something or going somewhere or experiencing something that they're only reading about. And that's what makes it really cool and really fun. And I've been in a lot of crazy rooms. I mean, I was in the room when Trump and Putin met for the first time. Um, I've been in, obviously, I've been in the Oval Office, I've been in the East Room. There are so many cool experiences, like flying on a Marine helicopter with the president as a part of a motorcade into like the Wall Street landing zone in New York City. I mean, there are so many incredible things that I have experienced in my career, and there's literally no way that I would have experienced those things if I'd been doing anything else. And you won't stay a journalist for those experiences. Don't get me wrong. That is not enough for you to stay in this business, because there are a lot of long nights. There are a lot of moments when you can't do what your friends are doing. You don't have as much flexibility when you are away from your loved ones. Um, Holidays don't exist to me. I basically work every holiday, because that's what we do in this business, is we work on holidays, because the news doesn't really take a day off, and on weekends and on at night and overnight and all of those things. But being in the center of the action, being a firsthand witness to history, is hands down the best part of the job that I do. And even as a television journalist, in which sometimes for those big moments you are in a studio, right? You're not in the room necessarily. I wasn't on the steps of the Capitol on January 6th, but I was in a studio when it was happening. And you're still a witness to those moments. The thrill of being able to be in a position to give the very first takes on something that is incredibly historic that is happening right before your eyes, it's a little terrifying and it's a little bit crazy, but it's one of the most awesome responsibilities that we have in this business, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Awesome. That sounds interesting. The first time that Trump and Putin met, you were in the room.
Yes, and it was one of the more insane experiences that I've had because there was like almost a fist fight between, the US press and the Russian press. And I think the other thing that was surreal about it, not to go on a tangent, but the other thing that was surreal about it was the bizarre warmth between the two men. I mean, Putin is, if you ask a lot of people, they'll say he's a stone cold killer, and he's a cold guy, like icy in his nature. But he was very warm toward Trump, and it was reciprocated. And it was very interesting to see that firsthand. It's an intangible dynamic that you capture when you're in the room. Putting aside how stressful it was just getting into the room. I mean, it was a meeting that almost didn't happen. They were trying to prevent the US press from coming in. It was really an insane time. And there was a lot of scrutiny, as you can imagine, global scrutiny on that moment. But it was, it's probably something I will never forget. And a lot of my colleagues, we laugh about it all the time because it was just literally a fist fight almost broke out, and nobody knew because we did our jobs. We got in the room, we got it on live television, and everybody saw it when it happened. And that's basically what we were there to do.
That's crazy. All those like little details that, when we're reading it or watching it, we don't necessarily see. It must be so amazing to get to actually experience firsthand. And I think I have to cut us off now, unfortunately. But thank you so much for coming and talking. It was an honor to speak with you and learn about your experiences. Are there any last thoughts you want to share? I think we probably have like 2 seconds, but
Oh, it is absolutely my pleasure. I love doing this. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Lily, for your questions. Um, I guess the last thing I'll say is just if you want to pursue journalism, I really encourage it. It's a tough job, but it can be worth it if you want to come into this business and change the world. You have the ability to influence the course of the world, and I mean, there are not that many jobs that you can say that for. So come on in, the water's warm. I'll be here, and if you want to find me on your CNN internship, come and find me.
thank you so much for talking to us again. This was wonderful.
Of course, thank you, Lily.
So much. Okay. I think we're still live stream, but I think to everyone watching, I'm so